Thanks very much, Greg, and welcome everybody to the final panel of the day, which is on the Justice Department and the FBI. And collectively on this stage, we have panelists who have served in the Justice Department under every elected president going back to Richard Nixon. Some of our panelists were there very recently and have resigned or been forced out. Others were there much longer in the past, but have kept in close touch, both by observation and by relationships with people. And I think together this panel is in a particularly good position both to talk about what's going on here and now on the ground at the department and the Bureau, and also to talk about how stark a departure that all represents. I'd like to begin just to set the stage by relaying a very brief excerpt from some remarks that were made in the Great Hall of the Department of Justice 85 years ago by Robert Jackson. Now, Robert Jackson, as many of you know, one of the giants in the history of American law. He would go on to become a justice on the Supreme Court who would author some of the most influential opinions of the century on presidential power and racial discrimination and other matters. He was a Nuremberg prosecutor. But at this moment in time, 1940, he was the Attorney General of the United States. And he had brought to Washington from all over the country all of the U.S. attorneys, his senior leadership, to gather together in the Great Hall of the Department so that he could explain to them what his expectations were of them. Think sort of Pete Hegseth, but no talk about grooming and fitness. And he started out saying, assembled in this room is one of the most powerful peacetime forces known to our country. Because he said the prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any person in our country. And then he talked about a bunch of other things. He talked about the importance of prosecutors having character and good judgment. He talked about some more prosaic things like how the department should balance the benefits of centralized decision-making in Washington versus localized decision-making in the various U.S. Attorney's office. But then he briefly addressed what he said was the most dangerous power of the prosecutor. And what he said was that most dangerous power, that he will pick people who he thinks he should get rather than pick cases that need to be prosecuted. In such a case, it is not a question of discovering the commission of a crime and then looking for the man who has committed it. It is a question of picking the man and then searching the law books or putting investigators to work to pin some offense on him. It is in this realm in which the prosecutor picks some person whom he dislikes or desires to embarrass, or selects some group of unpopular persons and then looks for an offense, that the greatest danger of abuse of prosecuting power lies. It is here that law enforcement becomes personal, and the real crime becomes that of being unpopular with the predominant or governing group, being attached to the wrong political views, or being personally obnoxious to or in the way of the prosecutor himself. That was the Attorney General of the United States in 1940. So, Brendan, some time has passed since then. Catch us up.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I have been looking forward to this panel for a number of weeks now because if I can give a little bit of a confession here, in my personal life, I'm an extremely progressive person, and I really encourage you not to look up my political donation history. And I think in ordinary times there would be a great deal for us to debate about. But at this moment, the things that divide us are far smaller than the things that unite us. And a commitment to, I find the commitment that I hope we all share to democracy and to the rule of law very meaningful. And I know for many of you on the conservative side of the aisle, you have made far greater personal and professional sacrifices to maintain your integrity than I've had to do. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. In terms of catching folks up from what Robert Jackson said, it's tough to follow Peter. It's especially tough to follow Robert Jackson here. Let me frame sort of two issues that I'm concerned about. One is, I think, the fairly obvious thing that we're all watching on the news every day, which is the targeted prosecution of political enemies. Obviously Jim Comey and Tish James, but, a political prosecution, even if it uncovers, facial crimes, is still a political prosecution. So, John Bolton I would consider in that bucket as well. I think that's extremely concerning. But just as important as the prosecutions that are happening are the prosecutions that are not happening. You can name that at the individual level. The fact that Tom Homan accepted $50,000 in a paper bag from an undercover FBI agent, which by itself may not be a crime, but is awfully concerning looking. The fact that he is still a high-ranking government official is, a terrible stain. You can think of other people that are not, individuals that are not being prosecuted, but I think that's all very concerning. But there's also the lack of prosecutions at the programmatic level. And I should be clear that I do believe that a president should be allowed a great deal of leeway in choosing priorities within the Department of Justice. If a president chooses to prosecute, or to pursue immigration, I may or may not disagree, may or may not agree with that, but that's within a presidential prerogative. Prioritizing cybercrime, crimes by international actors, or whatever it happens to be, there should be some leeway there. But I think we've gone far past that at this point. When you look at the fact that in a matter of months, the president disbanded the Klepto Capture Task Force, paused the prosecutions of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, FARA violations, the fact that the tax division is being neutered and the public integrity section has been effectively shut down. I have an acquaintance who was in the room with Emil Bovey when he said, one person in the public integrity section is going to have to sign this motion to dismiss the case or you're all fired. That kind of gangster activity is incredibly concerning. And I think, it suggests that these decisions not to prosecute are not based on sort of policy disagreements, but on the desire to shield certain favored individuals from justice and to effectively put them beyond the reach of the law. So I think that there are some optimistic things that I can say, but why don't I start with those extremely pessimistic ones, and I'll stop talking for now.
So Mike, I started with Robert Jackson. Let's move a short distance to Kash Patel. So the director said in recent congressional testimony, he said, as I travel around the country, in my experience, morale at the FBI has never been higher. So you have experience at the FBI. What's your take on that?
So I should begin by noting that as a matter of both policy and norms, it is never the case that an FBI employee should attempt to steal thunder or offer comments when main justice employees are on the stage. But given that we live in a world where policy and norms no longer matter in any capacity, I'll weigh in as much as I can. With respect to Patel's statement about morale in the FBI, I can definitively state that I spent close to 2 decades in the Bureau, both as a line agent in the field and in various roles within executive management. And speaking personally, I had a lot of connectivity to at least 3 field offices in which I had served and the entirety of the Hoover building. And in the few months where Kash Patel and I overlapped, I never saw morale worse. I never saw agents more worried. And I never saw looks of gloom on people's faces like I did every morning at a 9 o'clock meeting where we would get our new edicts from either our own headquarters or from ODAG. And I think I've been thinking about this a lot as we prepped for this panel about why that is. And within the FBI, I can't really speak to main justice, but within the FBI, it often surprises people to know that there has always been a culture of dissent. If you are a supervisor or an executive manager, and you're not getting yelled at by one of your employees about how you're doing something wrong or taking an erroneous step in an investigation at least once every 2 or 3 days, you're not really doing your job. And that's really important. Robert Jackson talked about the power to put somebody in prison. FBI agents, pretty much 24 hours a day, carry a gun on their hips. And they are entrusted with not only the ability to deprive people of their liberty, but it's sometimes to deprive them of their actual lives. That is a great responsibility, and it is not a responsibility that should be foisted upon an institution where you remove the ability of subordinates to think critically for themselves and push back against the decisions that their management make. Now, it is hierarchical. Of course, at the end of the day, the supervisor or the manager's decision has to stand. But what we're seeing under Patel and under Bongino is an environment where the average agent or even the average SAC cannot even voice dissent in a prefatory manner. And as a result, the hard conversations, whether they're about what the organization is going to deprioritize in order to shift resources to something like immigration, or about how it should handle investigating politically active figures of public renown who might be perceived as being targeted for their views, you're not having the hard conversations you need to. And not only is the organization weaker because of that, but the country is ultimately also both less safe and less secure in its liberties.
And let me just follow up before we move on. You mentioned the diversion or the reassignment of agents to immigration enforcement. One figure I saw suggested 25%.
Yeah, depending on which study you look at, the Cato Institute did a series of FOIA requests, which led them to believe that it was about 20%. I think it was ProPublica did a different series of FOIA's requests that read it to 25. But yeah, in my experience before I left, 20 to 25% of resources were being devoted and people were spending 20 to 25% of their time on it.
So you have that, you have the senior leadership sliced off, the people with, collectively decades of experience on cybersecurity, counterterrorism, violent crime. What is your assessment of the capability of the FBI today to execute on its mission?
It's crippled, particularly in the national security sphere. There is a real dichotomy within the FBI, I think, between the criminal investigations and the national security investigations. Both take some time to spin up. I'm not going to deny that. But a national security investigation is orders of magnitude more complex because when you're recruiting a source, you're recruiting somebody potentially in a different language, from a different culture, who has the same training you do, only in the service of a terrorist organization or a hostile foreign intelligence services. These are not things that you can just shift resources to and from overnight without a really deleterious effect on the investigations themselves. The most recent example of this was when we decided to bomb Iran, and I'm not making a judgment onto whether that was the right or wrong decision, but normally when you take military action against a foreign nation, you want to make sure that your counterintelligence capabilities against that nation are at their strongest point ever, because they may attempt to retaliate in our own homeland. And that's particularly true of a state sponsor of terrorism like Iran. And all of a sudden, after our planes took off and dropped their bombs, the FBI realized, wait, everybody who's been working Iran has been going out on street patrols for violent crime and rounding up illegal immigrants. And they shifted everybody back. I would humbly suggest that was too late. Those individuals needed to be recruiting sources, having their fingers on the pulse of the expatriate community, and rapidly devouring intelligence reports about what Iran might do in response, and that just wasn't happening.
Don and Stuart, you were both in the leadership of the department in a different time. You follow it closely today. You've heard what Mike and Brendan just said. Just give us your reflections on how we should understand and what we're hearing. Stuart, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Peter. I'm a conservative who wears a bow tie, so as my wife describes it, that's a form of social protest from the right. But To know what things are, you need to know what things were from a conservative standpoint. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm in it, but it's not about me. In the early 1970s, when I was an assistant United States attorney, I prosecuted a United States senator for accepting bribes. His case went up to the Supreme Court. It came back down to me to try. The greatest trial lawyer of that generation, and a man who became a friend of mine, was Edward Bennett Williams. He represented the accused senator, and he was also a person who was very politically prominent in Nixon-era Republican politics. The award for integrity at the Justice Department is called the Henry Peterson Award. It's named after a man, obviously Henry Peterson, who was the head of the criminal division for many years and was an outstanding lawyer and ethical model in his own right. As I was prepared for trial, Mr. Williams decided that he would try to exercise some political power that he had to get the case dismissed. And he appealed to the Attorney General. It was kicked down to Assistant Attorney General Peterson, and I was asked to come to the Justice Department to talk about the case. I'd never been in the main Justice Department building before. I'd not long been back from military service. I was a rookie. I knew something about prosecuting cases, and when I got to the department, I met Mr. Williams and a cadre of former Supreme Court clerks that worked with him, was on his team, and I was there alone, a rookie assistant U.S. attorney. Henry Peterson came into the room and asked me to join him in his office. We spent a few minutes, only a few minutes, in which he asked me about the case and how good it was. I said, well, we'd recently turned a witness. We were prepared for trial. We have a righteous case. Mr. Peterson thanked me. He walked into the next room and said, Mr. Williams, thanks for coming. And that was the end of the meeting. That's the way things were. We now have United States attorneys being picked and then ordered to bring cases. I litigated the very first case after Watergate, assigned by Earl Silbert. Earl Silbert put together a team that, in essence, went after the Nixon administration. Could anything be more different from the past to that? I mean, that's what we're seeing today. I can give other examples. I'll leave it to others and answer questions as they're asked. But in terms of describing an independent Justice Department, one where Earl Silbert brought the Watergate cases, where Bob Fisk distinguished himself in the Southern District over many years. We're obviously not seeing that today. The quality of justice has been substantially diminished. The service that you, taxpayers of the United States, are getting has been seriously diminished.
My time doesn't go back quite as far as Stewart's. I was in law school in the early 70s. In fact, I was in law school while Watergate was taking place. I remember sitting in a hot apartment in Washington in the summer of 73, I guess, watching the hearings. If you may some of you will recall the hearings back then. And going through law school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I was in law school, but I didn't know what I wanted to do as a lawyer. And Watergate kind of answered the question for me. I wanted to do something that would have me pursuing the truth, whatever that would turn out to be, and something that would be kind of simple and clearly a public service. And so what did I do? I clerked for a couple of years, but I ended up going as an assistant U.S. attorney. And I was lucky enough over the next number of years to have a series of great jobs. First was that one, and then ended up being actually a U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of California, and then Principal Deputy Solicitor General, and then ultimately the Deputy Attorney General. And all of that time, and it wasn't just for me that this was true, but all of that time, and I would say all of the time up to now, or at least up until January, and I think that's not an illogically precise date to end it, was really captured by an outlook for the department that had been built up, created in part by legislation, but mostly by norms and principles and a lot of thought. Attorney General Levy really spearheaded this. There's a book of his speeches that he gave at the time that was going on that sort of summarizes the thinking about it. But the basic principles and the things you'll hear assistant U.S. attorneys and others in the department talk about are these basic values, the values of equal treatment of everybody, even-handedness, fairness, openness of a decision-making process, valuing the career staff in the department was absolutely essential. Attorney General Levy talked about two things that I remember from those speeches. One was how being a prosecutor actually was, and the process of decision-making was a quasi-judicial act, was the way he saw it. It was something, you weren't a judge, you weren't going to decide the ultimate case, but you needed to take this very seriously, seeking justice, because you're going to affect a lot of people as you do that. So he talked about, decision-making by discussion, and he valued the inputs, and he had a transparent review process, and all of those things were built into the culture as well as embodied in various statutes that were passed that limited what government could do. Well, all of that's part of a culture. That was a real thing, and I think that brings tears to the eyes of people who worked in the Justice Department over the last 45 years or so. It's tragic to say what I'm about to say, but I'll say I don't want to say it's been destroyed, because maybe it hasn't been destroyed, but it's been rendered utterly ineffective in the last 10 months. All of those things have been, number one, there's no valuing of experience. There's no respect for multiple points of view. The process of discussion is, I assume, pretty much out the window in terms of seeking justice. And instead, we've brought in people just for their loyalty, just for their reliability in delivering on what the president wants. And we've we've forced the exit of, either fired or put people in positions where they had no choice but to leave, who were in critical leadership positions, who had the knowledge, who had the experience, who had the judgment that was necessary. And the idea that that could happen in that department in such a short time is absolutely incredible. One last thing I want to say, sort of by measure of what's happened this year, and I think all of us here, I think, clearly lived through the first Trump administration. And a lot of us, certainly in Society for Rule of Law and a lot of others, were involved then with enormous concern about what was happening in the department under Bill Barr. And he did a lot of things that were fundamentally aimed at undermining the values I'm talking about. But there's one very important difference between what he did, what he tried to do, and what's happening now. And that was, Barr did this as much as he could surreptitiously. He denied that he was doing it. He pretended that he was even-handedly making a special deal for Flynn and Stone. His use of a phony investigation, the Durham investigation, to go out and look into the investigation with regard to Russian interference, which was created, and then the aura was created that it was going to produce an indictment probably before the election. That we've got all this stuff, and Barr was flying around the world with him, looking into these things. Well, they never came up with squat. I mean, they basically ended up with a couple of indictments and one terribly minor, I think, conviction. But all of it was done under cover sort of lies to pretend like it wasn't happening. Roll forward 4 years. Where are we now? It's all out in the open. All the things that are being done, no one has to argue. You don't have to argue what they're doing. I mean, they fired everybody they can think of who might get in the way. They brought in Bondi and other people. They're rolling forward in every way. And now, this process of announcing plans for a line of political prosecutions is absolutely horrifying. I'll shut up after the next sentence. But I think that is the one thing, and others on these panels today have said it as well. That is the one thing. If he actually is able to pursue a line of prosecutions simply because he says do it, and for the reasons that Justice Jackson points out, you can find a case on most people if you want to. That's the biggest threat, I think, of all of these abuses that Trump has done. That's the one thing most people don't realize, but that could affect them personally. And that's the thing I think everybody needs to be thinking about. We're not far from that right now.
I might have somewhat a better opinion of Bill Barr than Don does, but I just note that Trump has proved too much even for Bill Barr.
So let me, to make this even more concrete, lay out something that actually happened in the halls of the Department of Justice and use it as a predicate for my next question, which we'll just go down the line on. So there's been some mention in earlier panels today of the JGG case. This is the case where people who were claimed to be members of Tren de Aragua were bundled into a plane and spirited to a squalid prison in El Salvador. So there was a meeting on Friday of the week before that weekend plane took off. Many of you have read about this, in which Emil Bovey, then the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General, told a group of litigators that those planes were going to take off that weekend no matter what. We know this because a whistleblower disclosed this. He then said that if any court tried to stop them, the department would have to consider telling the court, fuck you. And I'm using the word, I know it's vulgar, I apologize, but I don't think it helps in this situation to modulate the description of what happened. Now, in fairness to Judge Bovey, at his confirmation hearing, he was asked whether he said that. And he said, I don't recall. Now, I will tell you, I have had tens of thousands of conversations as a lawyer, tens of thousands at the Department of Justice, and I do not recall every one of them, even most of them. I could testify under oath that I never said we should consider telling a court to fuck you, and the vast majority of lawyers could tell you the same thing. Well then, there was a hearing, a weekend hearing, before Judge Boasberg, before the planes took off. And the politically appointed Deputy Assistant Attorney General, who appeared on behalf of the government at that hearing, was asked by the judge, are these planes going to take off in the next 24 to 48 hours? And the lawyer who had sat at the meeting where Bovey said, planes are going to take off this weekend no matter what, said, I don't know, Your Honor. And the judge said, well, let's take a recess so you can talk to your clients and find out, because we need to know that. So I need to know whether I have to consider whether to issue an emergency TRO. So there was a recess, and it was during that recess that the planes took off. So the question to the group is, particularly, Brendan and Mike, who've been there recently, you were in the trenches with a lot of people. Some of them, like you, have left or been forced out. Some of them are still there. Some of those who are still there are struggling. Others are embracing. What is your advice to people who are struggling? And just to make this, think about it if someone was sitting in that meeting, what they should do. But think about it if someone's not sitting at the meeting. They're working on a False Claims Act case, but they hear about this. What should they do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, one that many people that I know are literally struggling with, right now. I have an acquaintance who worked in SDNY, and he said that he hated Emil Bovey before it was cool. So he's had a reputation for a long time. He just got famous recently, I suppose. For every lawyer, I think it's in a different calculation. I referenced the PIN conversation, the public integrity section conversation, where Bovey was threatening to fire everybody unless somebody signed off on the motion to dismiss the Adams case. Which was a horrible sort of moral question or quandary that people were put in. One of the more senior attorneys in the room said, I know a lot of you guys have young kids. Some of you have chronic health conditions. I'm going to sign it so you guys can keep your jobs. And that guy was pilloried in the media because they didn't know that backstory. But I think I consider that a fairly selfless act, even though it did enormous damage to his public reputation. In terms of whether to stay or go, I would say in the first Trump administration, there would be a strong argument for staying. The idea being that, by being part of the bureaucracy, adhering to the culture of lawfulness that I think all of us are proud of with the Department of Justice and FBI, you can prevent the worst things or prevent the worst instincts from being acted on. Personally, I'm not sure that calculation works in this administration for the simple reason that they'll just fire you now. And I've seen any number of people that I knew who have been fired. I know any number of people who are trying their best to make sure that they don't get fired. But my concern is that by staying, people are giving credibility to cases and to a department that really don't deserve that credibility right now. So I think it's bad at a sort of macro level. I also worry for my friends who may convince themselves, for entirely understandable reasons, to sign off on facially valid investigations and prosecutions that are nevertheless pursued for political reasons. And when that happens, again, they lend their credibility to matters that truly don't deserve it. And they risk making themselves into fools in the public as it becomes clear why these investigations and cases are brought. So that's my calculation, but I recognize that other people who have different personal circumstances are having to make very different calculations, and it's unfortunate that so many people are really faced with moral crises right now, but that's where we are.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak from a little bit of a different perspective, because in a lot of ways it's tougher for FBI agents because a lot of them don't have a skill set that translates to the outside world. It's not easy for them to leave. I sort of joked with Brandon earlier, a DOJ attorney can go work at a law firm. If an FBI agent uses his or her skill set without a court order, it's just breaking and entering. I mean, maybe stalking, but there's not a lot of exit options. But to me, this really comes down to the oath of office and what we mean when we talk about the concept of an oath. And I know this is going to sound overly intellectualized. I promise I will bring it back to the real world. The notion of an oath, of a code, is that you don't let consequentialist factors influence what is fundamentally a moral decision. You do the right thing regardless of the consequences, regardless of the cost. If you are going to strap on a badge every morning, or you are going to get in front of a court and say, Your Honor, appearing on behalf of the United States, you have a moral duty which cannot be transgressed to do the right thing. If you stop doing that, then the institution is going to become empty and hollowed out. And what worries me is very similar to what Brandon was saying, which is it's very easy in your own mind to say, well, I'm going to make this little compromise in order to stand up on the big principle down the line. The problem is, how are you going to know when the principle is big enough? And I'll use an example that's probably going to be a little bit controversial. Number of prosecutors and a U.S. attorney in EDVA were fired in some cases, maybe resigned in some cases, because they didn't want to go through issuing an indictment that they did not think they had the predication to do. They did not think the facts were there to go before a grand jury and present this case. But they were willing to open the case, and they were willing to investigate it, in spite of the fact that the President of the United States had explicitly said on numerous occasions he had a grudge against this person and wanted to see him in jail. So what I think people need to remember who are still on the inside, you might show loyalty on day 1 or day 10, but when you stand up on day 30 or day 35, they're going to fire you or destroy you anyway. So just do the right thing from the beginning.
Well, I think what Michael just said, it's hard to go do anything more clear or better than that. There's an issue about, do you want to be there? And when I think about my own decision to go into the Justice Department, I would never in the world want to be, it would not be this time that I would ever think of doing it. But that's not what these folks are facing. They're facing a career that they're in the middle of and a hard choice. And I guess I think what Michael said is exactly correct. You know, you got to do the right thing. Well, if you're working in some part of the Justice Department where you're out of the firing line and you've got, you know, work to do that's rewarding, and you do it well and you do it right and there's no compromises, I got no case to make that you must leave. On the other hand, the perils that are likely to surround you and the temptations that are going to come. And with this president, who knows when or where they're going to come from? You know, what demands are going to be made in what circumstances on who? So the risks of it being unmanageable are great, but I got nothing against anyone who wants to stay and serve and do it right. It's just that it's going to be darn difficult.
What it says about the current environment brings to mind the old shibboleth that a fish rots from the head. And what we're really talking about here is, of course, there's a moral dilemma for any line agent, any line lawyer that faces under these circumstances. But it goes back to the head. And that's the president, and that's the director. And it's the job of those people not to attack their subordinates, but to protect them. These guys never served in the military. They don't know what danger is. They don't know what leadership is. They don't know what responsibility is. I was fortunate enough to work for somebody who knew all about it. Was the youngest airman shot down during World War I. That was President George H.W. Bush. We were friends, had a relationship other than an official one. But when President Clinton asked me to be the acting Attorney General, which in a position I served in longer than anybody who'd ever been the acting Attorney General, I said, look, I'm going to try to do the things that I've been doing for many years. Some may be opposing policies of yours. And he said, stop. Your position is not about party. It's about country. And that's a man who lived it. And that's what it depends on. I fired the director of the FBI during the Waco siege. I wasn't a hero. He was going off on an agenda that wasn't the administration's and wasn't in the interest of justice. In my view, it was in his personal interest. And the president supported me in that. That was President Clinton, who was not of my party and with whom I had any number of disagreements. But he knew that he was able to fire me at any time he wanted and stood behind me. And I was able to get support from a couple of American heroes, Floyd Clark, who was the deputy director of the FBI, Buck Revell, the legendary FBI agent, who mobilized people, who got them to understand what it was that was at stake at the time. That sort of thing is missing now. That sort of organizational esprit, the ones that win wars, that make America the country that it is. And that's what you have to think about. There'll be a congressional election in a year and a half. Maybe the populace will be mobilized and make a change. When I wake up tomorrow morning, I will have a conversation with a woman named Pam, who's a graduate of the University of Florida Law School. That won't be Pam Bondi, that will be Pam Summers, my wife, but I'll hear about it. And you know, it starts at home, and we're fortunate in the positions that we've had that we're able to act. And I recognize that sometimes personal fears, family issues will intervene. But the rest of us can stand up. In fact, all of us can. There's strength in numbers. We'll see what we do. Benjamin Franklin was right. It's in our hands.
So we've been talking some over the course of this discussion about targeting enemies. Let's talk a little bit about the flip side of that, which is helping your friends. Brendan, you alluded some to not investigating people. Let's talk about the pardon power, and I'll invite anyone who wants to talk about the pardon power to say something about it. That has been a sea change in the use of the pardon power, and I will just invite any member of the panel who wants to jump in to say anything. Mike, you look like you...
Yeah, I'm just going to give a personal anecdote that I think is very telling. I was the acting special agent in charge of my field office during the presidential transition. I had the dubious luck of ascending to that position the day before the inauguration when my boss got promoted. And shortly after, every single January 6th defendant, regardless of the charge, regardless of whether he or she had physically assaulted a law enforcement officer, was pardoned, an agent came into my office looking considerably worse for wear. I knew him well. He was a very good agent. He was a military veteran. His entire life had been in the service of his country, and he was in near tears. He explained to me he was incredibly conservative. He voted for Trump because he did not like the direction that the country had been taking over the past few years, and for a variety of cultural reasons, he thought that voting against Harris was the right thing to do, but he never in a million years could have foreseen that Trump would have pardoned people who assaulted federal officers. I resisted the urge to point out that Trump explicitly said he was going to do this on multiple occasions, but we need to remember what the pardon power was for and why the framers included it in the Constitution. It was not something that was particularly prominent in many other representative democracies that sprung up after 1789 even. And the reason was to prevent miscarriages of justice. It was so that individuals who had been wrongly persecuted or unjustly imprisoned had a last shot at obtaining justice and clemency. It was never intended. I defy anybody to find me anything in the Federalist Papers, in the anti-Federalist writings, in the philosophy of Locke and Mill, which influenced the framers. Show me where the pardon power was intended to benefit political allies of the sovereign. And that's what it's become.
This is a place to jump into a broader point that I want to make about, some people have started to talk about how do you fix the Justice Department? When once decent people are back in charge, God knows, let's hope that happens. What do you do to fix it? And then people start talking in terms of rules and things like that, and kind of casting it in stone. And my reaction to that is no. There certainly may be some modifications that are appropriate in terms of actual statutes, but we are never going to have a government with the power to take action against its people that is essentially not going to suffer very badly if people of bad character and bad will end up in power. And so, to me, the pardon power, has been a thing that has rolled along over the years. The history of it is, I think, very much up and down in terms of how much it's been used. I've known some pardon attorneys, some of whom have been very frustrated because the president isn't really interested, or other presidents who are interested in a particular way. It's not mostly been any kind of a problem, and I think a lot of pardon attorneys think it's probably not been used in the most effective way most of the time, but nothing like this has ever occurred. And I think you can make that last statement I just made about most of the things we talked about today, and about all the things that are being done by a person who isn't just a bad person, but he is willfully committed to the idea of solely focusing on himself and his own power, and in fact hurting people, because that will help to cement and support his power. And that's where we are right now, and I think fixing it is only going to happen by restoring a collective majority that believe in that and want that. And we've got something close to it, but we haven't had the numbers to make it happen. So it's a real challenge to get from where we are now to where we need to be in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, and I'm just going to make one other observation about the pardon power, which is, one thing that really struck me. We talk about things like that as about the president helping his friends, and it's certainly that, but it's actually also about making more friends. And what do I mean by that? The pardon of George Santos obviously not the most, the ones that Mike described are far more serious than, some con man, getting out. But one of the extraordinary things about that, of course, he met none of the traditional criteria for pardon, and they actually exist in the Department of Justice. He had only just started serving his sentence. He wasn't repentant at all. He had been prosecuted in part by the same Justice Department that this president presided over. He was clearly guilty and a scoundrel. Put all that aside. When the president pardoned him, one of the reasons he gave, in all caps, was, he always votes Republican, triple exclamation point. Now, they say that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. This president doesn't even pay that tribute. He doesn't pretend. He says it's because he always votes Republican. Why does he do that? Why doesn't he want to at least have a pretense that he's doing this on some other reason? And the answer is he wants to advertise that if you are a Republican, if you support him, you will get better treatment. And if you oppose him, you'll get worse treatment. This isn't just about helping George Santos. It is about instilling a culture of obedience and fear. And the criminal justice system, whether you talk about prosecutions or pardons, it's an extraordinary tool if you are willing to use it that ruthlessly to that end. So let me ask, unless, by the way, Stuart or Brendan, if you have something you want to say about pardons before I get to a topic that I think Don prompted in me, but Stuart.
Well, I subscribe to everything you said, and just to take off on a remark that I think you made a lot earlier. In our day, the pardon attorney was a woman called Margaret Love. She held that position for many years. There are regulations within the Justice Department concerning how the pardon attorney makes her evaluations and then recommends to the president. This is a question of what human beings are making these decisions. The pardon power is one of the broadest powers that the administration has, that the executive has. Perhaps war powers is the only thing that comes close to it in terms of its history and the reasons why it exists, why we differentiated ourselves from the rule of a king. And so the question is, how is that virtually unlimited power and within constitutional terms exercised? And that comes down to humans. That comes down to the people who exercise the office. It's easy. It's a power easy to abuse. And it's not just this president who's done it. There have been questionable pardons over a number of administrations. Ultimately, it comes down to us. Who are we going to vote for? What matters? And we're at a time now where you have to answer that question. And I don't think I have anything more to say about it.
Just very briefly, because I know we're running up on time. I loved your phrasing of this is in part about making new friends, and I think that's exactly right. As part of the Capitol siege section, which was focused on prosecuting the rioters from January 6th, I always operated on the assumption that Trump was not going to pardon the folks that were convicted of assaulting federal officers because of his nominally pro-cop agenda. I think once that happened, the pardons came out on Monday. I announced I was leaving on Wednesday. I was gone by Thursday. I didn't even get my stuff from my office. It's still there. But I think very specifically for the rioter pardons, I think certainly the effect, and I think likely the intention, is to empower essentially paramilitary organizations that are going to be allied to the president but beyond the reach of the law. And that can sort of go across a spectrum here. At the far end, you've got the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Enrique Tarrio said he's getting revenge after he got pardoned. To the more informal folks, you guys maybe remember the QAnon shaman with the horns. The week he gets pardoned, I believe, he says that he announces that he's buying guns. And they have been told, because they got these pardons, that if they are allied to the president, if they act in his name, they will literally be beyond the reach of the law. And obviously that's very concerning.
So let me turn to something which picks up on something Don said, which is, let's assume at some point there is an election in the Justice Department with a different sensibility. Maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 7 years, whatever, but at some point. And you are the new Attorney General or the new director of the FBI. And the question is really, what do you do? And just to put a fine point on it, this isn't just, well, I don't target my enemies, I introduce neutral, merits-based, apolitical charging decisions, and I bring back, plastic straws and whatever else, you want to, it's not just that, right? Because we still have that huge brain drain from these institutions. We have an influx of people in career positions, some of whom are, I'm sure fine and good, and some of whom were drawn in for the wrong reasons. And you can't necessarily tell them apart in the first instance. Plus, they're all protected by the civil service laws. You have cases that have been closed and other cases that have been opened on questionable criteria. You have investigations, same thing. You're inheriting an operation with a completely different culture. How different depends on whether we're talking about 3 years or 7 years or whatever. So how does a new attorney general or a new director of the FBI think about what their day 1 to day 100 to day 365 focus is and how they should handle their responsibilities? And let's just go down the line on that.
Okay, well, and I'm approaching this from the line level, so I'm deferring to the far more senior folks for what the Attorney General should do. Perhaps I could twist the question just a little bit about what could potentially be done now, if that's okay.
Sure.
In a world where the Department of Justice is essentially uninterested in prosecuting, white-collar criminals or allies of the president or things like that, I think it's really important to think about how can we achieve some measure of justice in the interim. The most obvious alternative source here is state and local prosecutors. I mentioned Tom Homan accepting that $50,000 in cash. It would be really interesting to find out if you reported that $50,000 on his state tax returns. If there is an interested prosecutor, I don't know if he resides in Virginia or Texas, but depends on where he is. There might be an appetite for looking at these things. So I think that I hope that despite the resource constraints, state and local prosecutors recognize that they are really going to have to fill the gap to the extent that we want to hold rich criminals in particular accountable to the law. I would add as a second point here, one of the things that I've been talking about with a lot of sort of my peer attorneys, and we're looking at getting some litigation started. I'd love to talk to the folks, at the social hour if you guys have additional, sort of targets and legal theories here, is how can we pursue some of these actions civilly that ordinarily would be pursued criminally? One of the areas that I'm really excited about is, state unfair competition laws. So, there's been a lot of public reporting about crypto scammers paying the administration allies $5 million to get their SEC or DOJ investigations dropped. Obviously, DOJ is not going to be pursuing that sort of corruption. If you are the crypto company that is not bribing the government, you have been competitively harmed by the crypto companies that are. California has enormously broad standing. It's pretty easy to survive a motion to dismiss in California state court. So, you can think about that. You can think about civil RICO, FCA claims, and so forth. So we're looking for creative legal theories. To the extent you guys have them, I would really love to have that conversation. But I say all of that to make the argument that we are not hopeless even now, that there are actions that we can take to try to uphold the rule of law even before, hopefully, a more law-abiding administration takes over.
So I'm going to be considerably more pessimistic, potentially despair-inducing. But, I'm only speaking about the FBI here because I was never an attorney with DOJ. But in some of my personal darker moments, I do question whether the FBI can ever be fixed. Because we can group people into different categories based on how they're reacting to what's going on. There are the people who are going to get fired and their decision's been made for them. There are going to be people who decide that they just can't take what's happening and they're going to voluntarily leave. There's going to be people, which I suspect are the largest group, that are going to keep their heads down and do their job until they're backed into a corner and then decide in the moment how they're going to act. But we can't also discount a fourth group, which is the group of people who see what's happening and realize that it creates opportunity and that they can ascend to positions of power. And I saw that all too often at the FBI. In fact, the FBI is making a point of only promoting people to senior executive positions who are not eligible for retirement. So they're over a financial barrel, and if they stand up and do the right thing, they're going to lose their entire retirement plan and their health benefits. But people are still applying for those promotions. So what does that say about their moral calculus and their willingness to compromise? And what do we do when there is a new director? Do we just fire everybody who did that? It's an enticing solution. It has a ring of justice to it. But then the FBI, which has always been a career organization, becomes a political one, where Patel fired people he didn't like, and then a new director, operating from a very different set of principles, fires the people he or she disagrees with. I don't know how the FBI ever becomes depoliticized after this. I really don't, and it's something I struggle with. And if the FBI becomes a politically motivated organization, people aren't joining it for the right reasons, and it is almost inevitable that political prosecutions and political investigations are going to happen. With that, I will hand it off to the remaining two panelists who are hopefully have a sunnier disposition than I.
Just real quick, it seemed to me back when Biden came in that it was a real simple solution. I wrote a little article in the USA Today, and I said, all he needs to do, all Merrick Garland needs to do is go back and put back in place, because Bill Barr was playing games with everything, put back in place and openly say so and have sort of a national teaching moment, the policies that had been in place before and the norms and everything else. And it turned out that was, Merrick Garland, in my opinion, is the most abused, unfairly treated attorney general I think we've had. I don't know about forever, but he actually did, in my opinion, he actually did the things that you would think you would do. He bent over backwards, in my opinion, to be fair and even-handed. He wasn't all that exciting, and maybe that was a problem, but in any event, he did what he needed to do. The problem is, and I don't see it going away, is, and the question will be, if the good guys somehow get back in power, what is our culture going to be at that point? And if you've got, if we have just enough votes to elect somebody who's not a crazy egomaniac, but we got a lot of people who are crazy, it's going to continue. And all the social media, all of the attacks, all of everything, it's going to be a paranoid attack. And now it'll be, well, whoever it is in power is now weaponizing the Justice Department. And so how do you restore it in that culture? That, to me, is the biggest problem.
When I started working with the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the agency. It committed violations of individual civil rights all over the place. It was often ineffective as a criminal investigative agency for a variety of reasons, and it was vastly outstripped in counterintelligence capability by the still relatively new CIA and NSA. It might not have been with my support, but going back a little ways, even before my time, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States, and in an act of severe nepotism, appointed his brother to be the Attorney General. But he was a strong believer in civil rights. He had opinions and views and an infrastructure available to him that could turn the Justice Department to things that it wasn't doing, or away from things that it was doing. And he did. He brought in people, Kennedy, for well or ill, inspired a lot of young people, many of whom joined the Justice Department and U.S. attorneys' offices. He hired people like friends of his, like Burke Marshall in civil rights and the like of that, set up a new division, worked around the FBI because they never got along with Hoover. But there were people like Buck Revell and others who were more committed to justice than they were to a cult of personality. So it can be done. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic because I'm not a good soothsayer. But I know from the early 1960s, the so-called civil rights era, where that was the where that was the function, and less the enforcement of criminal law, though the Attorney General then was strong on the enforcement of criminal law. So it can be done, but it has to do with leadership, and quality leadership depends upon the people who put it in place, and that's us.
I'm just going to ask one final question, and I'm going to direct it solely to Brendan. And I'm doing this because he's written on this subject, and I know, and it seems like something we should all hear. And that is that people sometimes, I think, all of us out there who are concerned, people sometimes despair that anything they do matters. And so what can people do, and should they despair?
Yeah, well, thank you, and I feel embarrassed to get the last word when far more senior people are on the panel, but that's very kind of you. So, you know, I wrote a piece when I first quit about the power of public speech or public action to influence bureaucracies. I don't know how many of you guys have worked in government before, but I think for anybody that has, you know, it's viscerally clear that public opinion actually does change how bureaucracies operate. The more or less popular something is, the more or less likely it is that line-level attorneys or people above them are going to act enthusiastically or are going to resist. And contrary to public, you know, sort of public memory here, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, had to roll back any number of its policies, probably most famously its child detention policy, because they were overwhelmingly unpopular. I agree, you know, we live in a very scary time, but we have a big advantage, bluntly, over countries that have experienced the same thing, you know, Hungary, Poland, India, Iran, and so forth, which is that this administration is not popular. And it seems to be getting less popular all the time. So just very briefly, if I just share this quote, a friend wrote this a while ago, and I've been pushing it on everybody because it moves me very deeply. I hope I don't choke up just reading it. But she says, "I've come to see optimism as a kind of long-term organizing and survival tactic. If we don't believe that we can make this world better, what are we even doing? Hope is hardest to maintain on days when our rights and protections are being actively stripped away, but that's when it's most important too. And if nothing gets better in our lifetimes, then we lay the groundwork for future generations to reclaim their rights to public safety, autonomy, and enfranchisement." Thank you.